All right, greetings everybody. As hope you're all doing okay today, and I guess it's safe to say I need a haircut. All right, so here we go. Let's begin with the first half of our last unit for this year, chapter 7, which is unit 5, which in our case is looking at ethnicity and political geography. So as we move forward, or let's take a second. We just completed culture. We talked about how people become who they are, how the values and the core beliefs and the morals and the languages and the religions and all these things that make a group come about, and all the steps that happen prior with agriculture and not moving and creating states and then figuring out who we are. Well, now we're going to go a little deeper and go a little more into the nuts and bolts of who people are, and we're going to look at the idea of ethnicity. We're going to look at the idea of race, because that's not the slightest bit controversial. And then we're going to look at how we're going to end our time together this year with how, when all this coalesces and we have a sense of who we are in this, how then the next step is to make it official, make it legal, and make a country. All right. So first things first, let me get my beret ready. All right, here we go. All right, laddies and lasses, let's talk about ethnicity. So, what ethnicity is? Again, the old adage here. I'll put me there. All right. Um, it's the identity with a group of people who share the cultural traditions of a particular homeland or hearth. So again, ethnicity matters because this is human geography. It's humans, it's geography, and we are concerned with origins. We are concerned with homeland. We are concerned with hearth. And an ethnicity is a cultural group that is tied to a place, that place plays a role in the concept of a culture. Okay? Again, down here, it's great. The idea of a cultural heritage. That's what it is. That's ethnicity. Race is biological. Okay, race is the identity with a group of people who share a biological ancestry. It is biology, 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 which means it could be anywhere in the world and still be related racially. That's skin color is one way it's looked at. Again, and we can talk about that one gene being maybe too important, but that's again for the sake of AP Human Geography, and which is what we're studying, and for the sake of just being able to break them into things. Um, that's just the example we're using. And then the final thing, which really comes to a head in the next chapter, is the idea of nationality, and that is the idea of nationism. The idea that our collective culture and our collective ethnicity, who we are as a people, that we all share so many things in common that we become a nation driven by the same things, and then eventually it's that drive that that forces or that kind of motivates us for the creation of a country. All right, the joke is over. Okay, that's even funnier here. Okay, plus that's really hot. All right, so now ethnicities in the United States. Here we go. There are four major ethnic groups in the United States. They are Hispanics, African Americans, Asian Americans, and then the American Indian, Native Hawaiian, or Alaskan Native. Okay, the indigenous peoples, I guess, would be a simpler way to put it. A Hispanic is somebody who might, and this is also a nice opportunity to discuss the differences between a Hispanic and a Latino. Um, Hispanic is somebody who migrates, whose ancestors migrated from a Spanish speaking country. A Latino is somebody from Latin America. And there's a difference. Okay, Latin America is the Latin Catholic Spanish speaking part of the Americas because of imperialism. So the Spanish, the conquistadors and the people who settled, um, Argentina and Chile and places like that, they're Hispanic. The people who live there are Hispanic, but they're also Latin American. A Spaniard is Hispanic if they come to America, but not a Latin American. Okay. About 17% of Americans claim this. And by the way, Hispanic was uh, deemed inoffensive in 1973 by the United States government. So white people in 1973. It's Most prefer to identify with their specific ethnicity. So, what they're saying is that instead of calling someone a Hispanic, they would rather be called Spanish or Portuguese or something like that. And again, a third of the population is in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. A quarter of the population, and this is the Hispanic population, is in California, and then you see where the rest of them are. And now also remember too that and this is rather timely, that with the census in 2020, probably now delayed till 2021, so there'll be an asterisk next to that. It will be interesting to see how these numbers changed if new states make the list. That would be interesting. And again, if you go back to the laws of migration, who's the guy, who's the model? That's right, Ravenstein. Um, it would make sense that these are the areas geographically where the most Hispanics live. The next group are the African Americans, forced migration, by the most part, 300 years ago from West Africa. Most of our African population is West African. Those of African descent in India and places east would be East African. Again, in the Southeast, 12% of Americans claim they're African American. We are now starting to DNA test to actually find out where the heritage is from. So that maybe in the not too distant future, an African American could answer that question more like a Hispanic and say, no, 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 I am Ghanaian or I am, I am Senegalese or things of that sort, as opposed to just saying I'm African American. Because remember, Africa is a continent, and Africa is just not brown people or dark brown people. African is light brown people. Africa is white people. Um, Maybe not native or indigenous, but white Africans are a thing. Again, in the Southeast, in the Deep South, in the slave states, um, where agriculture and was the necessary, where our history dictated there be slaves. I find it interesting that there are 9 states in Upper New England. That's Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, uh, Rhode Island, and then out west, where less than 1% of the population is African American. Uh, and it's not going to be New York because of cities, um, but it's because, again, there was no reason for them to go. There was no agricultural population, no agricultural. I mean, they farmed, but not, there was no plantation farming. And they just didn't migrate there for whatever reasons. The pull factors weren't great enough. Asian Americans trace their heritage back to Asian cultures, as you can imagine. 40% of all these people are in Hawaii. The other half, about 12%, half of the remaining 12% live in California. Again, you have Ellis Island in New York, you have Angel Island in San Francisco in California. Those were the two hubs of immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century in America. And then you have the American Indian, Native American, and Alaskan Indian. Okay, that's 2%. So you're looking at 7, 19. You're looking at 36% of the population are these ethnicities, which means that during this time period, 64%, 74% of the other population, or 64% of the remaining population, 64% is not these people. So it's white, Caucasian, primarily, because if you think about it, the Asian thing is going to change over time. This number is going to go up because, as you know, in AP Human Geography, West Asia is the Middle East, and if they're coding it correctly, then that population is going to increase with the refugee crisis and with people moving here. What's the other one I was going to think of? No, that was the big one. How would that change, or are they going to add a fifth ethnic group to the census? Maybe. All right, and then this is just a map. Again, what type of map? That's right, choropleth map, showing you via color where the 3 largest ethnic groups tend to live. Again, Hispanic and Latino community is where you would expect it. The African American community is where you would expect it. And then the Asian community here and here, where you have various enclaves. Going back to the FRQ, various places, various large cities where they would be allowed in, and where there would be work, and via chain migration, um, other things. It's also worth knowing that Asian is, like I referred. Look, here in RTP, we have a very large Indian population, relatively speaking, in the Triangle area. That's India. Um, in Greensboro, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, is a large Vietnamese population because at the end of the Vietnam War, when Vietnamese refugees came to the United States, that area took a large number of them. Dearborn, Michigan has the highest Muslim population in the country, density. Up here in Chicago, again, Asia is not just East Asia. It's not just China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. Asia is a large expanse. So the reason you'll see different groups in different parts of the country, like here or here, is not just because of East Asia or because of other things, but it could very well be because of what most people call Middle Eastern. That's an Asian populace. Now, race. The following features are thought to be scientifically classifiable. So there is a scientific, and again, a couple of things. Thought to be is important to note. However, comma, in human geography, biology doesn't matter. And and the reason we say this is because in human geography, in this study, from a geographical perspective, hearths matter. And there's no way to trace the hearth of a skin color as far as I know. It's not rooted to a specific place. Um, so um, so as the basis of race, so for the basis of race, it's not a big deal. But for trying to figure out who lives where and how we separate people, we'll look at race for that reason, from a sociological perspective, or from a why do certain people who with certain skin colors live in certain places. Why they live there, how they live there, is more important to us than other things. The other interesting point is the one at the bottom, where the only way for us to be genetically different, completely distinct, is to isolate. And that leads to inbreeding and then eventually mutation. That's just the way genes work. It's just the way DNA and biology works. So, if you truly want to make, I guess, a different race, you got to get a bunch of people away from each other for a long time. But for our standpoint, for the AP Human Geography standpoint, it's where do these groups live? Where do they? How do they attend school? This ties more to the other things previously spoken. What cultures evolve? What behaviors evolve? What those types of things. Where do they live? How do they use the land? What do they use? What has value to them? That's what we look at, and human geographers look at is the relationship between man and the environment again. Racism is the biological classification based on race. It's a belief that one race is superior and one race is biologically inferior to another. A person who believes this is a racist. President Obama illustrates the complexity of designating race and ethnicity in the United States because, and I don't need a textbook, because if you think about it, depending upon whom you ask, depends upon how he's seen. To some members of this country, he was a black president. To some members of this country, he was not a black president. He was a biracial president. So it he was a conundrum. I also like the fact that on this slide we have this. Now, first of all, those are two separate things, but at the same time, they weren't necessarily separate things all the time. Whites only beyond this point. I think anybody growing up in the South or anybody who's watched any movie taking place in the 1960s or earlier understands that. Yeah, but what's also interesting to note, and a little kind of American history lesson for you, is that the Irish up north were treated similarly. No, not the same. No, they weren't slaves. So no, it was not as bad. But the Irish were seen as inferior peoples to those of English descent and those from Europe. There were some people in England during the 18th, 19th century who believed that there were certain species of monkey further up the evolutionary chain than the Irish. If you look at old political cartoons where, I mean, one of the ultimate ironies, Dr. Seuss was drew some horrific World War II cartoons depicting Japanese people and others. But the Irish were often drawn in political cartoons to look like gorillas or monkeys, apes. So they were seen as less than ideal people. I love Miriam here on Twitter. I'm sure hope she appreciates being immortalized forever. But again, seeing people as inferior because they're not you is racism. Okay, according to the United States Census Bureau, Hispanic or Latino is not considered a race. Members of Hispanic or Latino ethnicity select any race they wish. So you can be a white, a black, or other Latino or Hispanic. It's also worth knowing that in the 20th century, their position in America changed. That there were certain times in America where they were seen as white ish, and then certain times in America when they were seen as black. And it all kind of coalesced and coincided with how they were viewing other minorities at that time. But the Hispanic uh, um, attitudes towards Hispanics were fluid in the first part of the 20th century. African Americans as an ethnicity and black as a race encompass different groups. In 2010, they combined it. So now, descendants from Africa make the African American ethnicity. Other American blacks trace their heritage to regions such as Latin America, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Interesting. Again, to be an African American, technically speaking, and you'd have to be someone who moved from Africa and became a citizen. That's technically an African American. If you're an African American child, and you're not born in Africa, you're no more an African American than I am an Irish American or a Ukrainian American. We value those cultures and that part of who we are. But anyway, African American identifies a group with a cultural tradition, and I guess this is why it's so different because of America's history and creation, and because slavery is such a big deal in who we are as a country, whether it's North or South. I mean, it doesn't really care. That it makes things different. All right. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, oh, lovely. There's a stereotype. Asian is recognized as a distinct race. So in this case, race and ethnicity are lumped together, and people of this group may have ties to a number of countries, and they may look nothing like this. In fact, if you take the time and study physical features, Chinese and Japanese people look different. Laotian and Vietnamese people look different than Chinese and Japanese people, and um, they don't like being called Japanese. The Chinese don't. I mean, well, most of East Asia and Southeast Asia don't like being confused as Japanese because they were invaded and ruled by them. Also, calling them an Asian is a slur and it's lazy. Or growing up, and if you watch movies from the 30s and the 40s about calling them Orientals. And again, the other thing worth knowing here is that Iran and Iraq are in places like that are Asian countries, and they look nothing like that. Okay. Now, an enclave is a term that has been mentioned before. I will mention it again. An enclave, and again, this goes back to scale of size, whether it's a group of people, like an ethnic group, or a race, or even a country. You can have countries that are enclaves inside other countries. And we'll get more to that in the next unit. But an enclave is where you have a high concentration of a certain ethnic group, and it is distinct from the other surroundings. Okay, most are areas within large cities. Usually, they're formed through chain migration. Because again, one of the benefits of chain migration is I know if I go to Chicago or to New York or to Boston, that there are going to be a group of people like me who can speak my language, so I can get my questions answered, who can cook my food. Because let's not downplay how important food is, and it's less scary. And that's one of the ways this works. Some examples of urban ethnic enclaves are the Goutte d'Or neighborhood in Paris. A third of those residents belong to ethnicities who have emigrated from African colonies of France. So again, ethnic groups from the former African colonies, Algeria, and others come to France and live. London, they have South Asian, they have Indians in the west, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis in the northeast, African blacks in the east, and Caribbean blacks in the north and the south, because again, England was everywhere in the 19th century. And then the United States is mainly in the big cities. Okay, areas like Chicago, mostly on the south and the west side, whites on the north side, Hispanics on the northwest and the southwest side. Okay, so, and then over here, this is Chicago. Okay, I can see this right here. There's Lake Michigan, and over here is O'Hare, and okay. Um, how, and then over time, you're going to have migration patterns, and this comes up more in the chapters we're not going to get to. So if you get a chance, look over Unit 6 and the last two units, especially the last unit, because the last unit itself deals with cities themselves and how cities change and how they're fluid and populations move over time. In the early 20th century, and this goes back to our immigration unit, Eastern European workers and Southern European workers, Greece, Italy, the Slovak states, places like that, they came to the United States for factory work, to get work. You have Greek town and you have Pole town. You have to remember too that Germans have been coming over. Well, ethnic Germans, but they had been coming over previously, and they are the I mentioned this the Pennsylvania Deutsch, which is really where we get Pennsylvania Dutch from, because Americans butcher words all the time. So there were German-speaking peoples and German and ethnically German people in Pennsylvania, and then they moved west through Ohio into the Midwest, into Minnesota and places like that, for land to farm. There's a large, really quiet. One of the cool kind of AP Hug things that come out of this is it's like one of the largest, quietest ethnic groups in America, and it's so well assimilated. Again, other ideas like in New York, Little Italy, if you want to go, there are restaurants in New York or Boston where you go, and there's no menu. They bring you the house dish. They bring you the house Chianti. All right. Um, this is. See if I find notes here. See if I get notes. Hold on. No notes. All right. Anyway, white Irish, white British, white Asian Bangladeshi, Asian Pakistani, Asian Indian, Black African, Black Caribbean, other Arab. Must be London. And this just shows you, and again, wherever you see pockets of no color, you see pockets of other color. So this shows you sort of this is the ethnic breakdown of London. And one thing you notice here is that these three groups, no, the, these three groups right here, much more throughout the city. Whereas the Asian groups tend to be more clustered together, the Arab groups tend to be more clustered together, as well as the Black Caribbean and the Black Africans. And even though there's overlap, but there's still places where you see larger congregations of strictly one or the other. So you can see that in London, people tend to live, or in any city, people tend to live where they're going to feel more comfortable, where they're going to feel safer. Now, Brazil is composed of people whose ancestors emigrated from Portugal, West Africa, European countries, Japan, Southwest Asia, plus a large portion of indigenous peoples. Now, the Germans, that's the European countries, lots of Germans came after World War II. They came to Brazil, they came to Argentina to run away from their behavior in the Second World War. And I don't know. Another group of white people settled in Brazil after the Civil War, because when the Civil War ended, slavery was still legal in South America. So a lot of slave owners who could not live in this land of no more slaves in America, a number of them moved to South America. They classify people according to skin color. Brazilians do not care for census choices and must identify themselves as other colors. So, that's interesting. And I also noticed too that the further south you go, the the whiter Brazil gets. And kind of alluding to some of the questions that have come up with respect to how do we know about certain countries, how do we know about this? Well, regardless of what you know about Brazil, you know an awful lot about what color means in the world, but just because you live in America and what different colors mean. So as you move south in Brazil, what are some assumptions? And they are assumptions that you can make with respect to quality of life, to development, to things of that sort. And if that's the case, and if most of Brazil is this color, is brown, because 60% or more here, no more than 60% here, which means it's still at least 50, and then no more than 40%. So you still have a very large um, former African, former indigenous brown population. Based on what you remember about development and the demographic transition model and all those things that we spoke of earlier, where do you think Brazil is there? How do you think Brazil is developing? Why do you think Brazil is in the shape it's in? I know you're 15, 16 now, but if you look up the Olympics, like why the Olympics were, um, why is it that some people think there's only 3 or 4 countries in the world who should ever host the Olympics ever? They should just rotate. Why allowing countries like this to host the Olympics is inherently bad. And all those things are possible in a nutshell just based on this map. Throw in some topography, throw in where the mountains are, where the rivers are, throw in what the land looks like, and you could actually answer a question to generally explain Brazil. And then you can take that and extrapolate to other countries similarly designed, built like Brazil. So it's in there, it's in your heads. I don't like myself over here, but all the slides are on the other side. Now, don't worry about that. Okay, key issue 2. Why do ethnicities have different distributions? So why are ethnicities in different places? That's what this is asking. All right, so here we go. One reason we have ethnicities in different places is forced migration. 400,000 Africans came to the 13 colonies. Most were brought here illegally, because in 1808 we banned importation of slavery, which is also why slaves became expensive. Slavery was very rare in Europe, but the Europeans were responsible, for bringing the slaves to the Western Hemisphere, because even in Western Europe, I mean, let's be realistic. Well, one, you had serfdom, so you had people there, and they couldn't leave. If you remember your world history lessons, serfs don't belong to a person, serfs belong to the land. So whoever owns the land owns the people. So until the plague, uh, serfs are stuck there. Now, it is important to note that during this time period, after the plague, roughly from 1400 moving forward, serfdom declines, doesn't go away, but it begins to decline in Europe. Now, it goes on for a long time in Russia. In fact, serfdom in Russia may have just ended before we got rid of slaves. There's something to be proud of. But Western Europeans sold slaves. So one reason they didn't have slaves in Africa by and large is because of serfdom. And then two, um, the crops grown in the Americas necessitated slaves. They necessitated labor. Native Americans ran away and hid. Um, they tried Irish and local and native English people, and they couldn't handle the heat. But also, the thing that is important to note about that is Irish and British, Irish especially, even though they were Irish in British eyes, they were still white and Christians. And the Christian thing plays a big part in this. All right, so we have the whole triangular trade. They come over this way. If you've ever seen the movie Amistad, I highly recommend it. There's a scene where they start throwing slaves overboard because you only have so many. They overpacked slaves because they had to bring so many across for their orders, and some would die, so they overpacked them. Eventually, it's also important to know that most slaves went to the Caribbean or to Brazil. and that most of the slaves who brought to America, only 5%, roughly 5%, 10% came directly to America. The rest came from the Caribbean via triangular trade. So very few slaves came here directly. Um, our slave population was maintained through breeding. So so there's this, and then this just shows you where um, slaves went and who owned the land. Who were the imperial powers during this time? Now notice that there are people going here. There are these are slave trade routes, so there are slaves going here, um, but typically they would go other places. Okay, and again, Portuguese, French, Dutch. All right, all along here. It's also I've spoken about to this with other students. The slave trade along the coast of Africa was dictated by the Africans. Um, they got rid of the criminals, those who they defeated in war, the weak or the infirm, the mentally handicapped, things. I can't think of a better word. I'm sorry. They controlled it. The British or the Portuguese or the Dutch would stay in the little slave town. They'd bring the slaves to them. They brokered the deal. It's not until later on in the slave trade where you see people having to go further into the country, into the continent to get slaves because they traded guns and silver and things for the slaves, and so the African people on the coast would go hunt with the guns, get other Africans and sell them, mainly to protect themselves, but eventually there's gonna be none left. Okay, now another way that different ethnicities and groups disperse through the world is through voluntary migration. Um, at Latin America and in Asia in the late 20th century, we had quotas. There were quotas for every different ethnic group. There were things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and other things that kept groups out of America in the early part of the 20th century, especially after the Civil War and as we start to industrialize. And the reasons then are the same reasons now. They don't look like us. They don't talk like us. They're not American. They're taking jobs. I mean, they're going to destroy our country from within, all those things. In the 20th century, quotas limited number. We talked about that, and then this changes here in the 60s and 70s. They come for agricultural work. They come for other work. In the 1970s, a lot of Asians, especially people from Vietnam and communist parts of the world, are coming to escape that. Um, in the 21st century, most are grandchildren of immigrants. So that's a fascinating thing that most children born here are the grandchildren of someone who immigrated to this country. So they're only second generation. That's kind of cool. Chinese is the largest, Asians, followed by Indians. I like that. Thank you for giving them their due. Filipinos, Koreans, and Vietnamese. Filipinos, this is the one place where you see a result of imperialism affecting American population. Like I said, in France, there are enclaves of Africans from the former French colonies in England and in London specifically. One of the jokes is that Indian food is the official food of England. It's also very good in England. If you get a chance to have Indian food in England, go. But there's a large Indian population, a Jamaican population. Again, all those different groups that you saw in that map of London are all people from parts of the world that were under British control. Well, the Philippines was one of those places in America, and Puerto Rico being another one. But this is the one that sticks out to me the most because of imperialism, that we defeated the Spanish in the Spanish American War, and we kicked them out of the Philippines, and then we stayed. And then we built military bases there, and then a lot of women and Filipino women and men marry service members to come back to America. Then they have kids. But also because it allowed being an American territory allows for easier movement. And then we have interregional migration, and we talked about this previously in the migration unit. At the end of the Civil War was the first sort of great migration, but that one wasn't that great for the simple reason is that America is still not as industrial as it's going to be, and slaves didn't know anything other than farming. When the Civil War ends, you're a free man, but you're still a free man who probably can't read, who probably can't write. You are functionally illiterate. You know how to navigate. You can farm. You don't have any money. You don't have any family. You have nowhere. All the reasons that people move, if you go back to Ravenstein again, all those different things that make it easier to move are lacking most freed slaves. So they stay in the South. And then Southern plantation owners at the end of the Civil War had sort of first hiring rights. So they could keep their best workers. Most work as sharecroppers, and basically you work the fields for a landowner. You get to share some of the crops. Um, it was a really, really, really crummy system, whereas you never made enough money every year, so you could never leave the land because your crops would be just short. So you have to get a line of credit for the seeds and the tools to plant. Then the owner would get a share of your crop, and that crop would be just short. So you go deeper in debt, deeper in debt, deeper in debt, high interest, so you could never leave the farm. Um, you begin to mechanize, and what you're growing change and diversifies. It's not just cotton, cotton, cotton. It's other things, big soybeans, tobacco, fruits, corn, things of that sort. Um, and so you diversify so you don't need the labor. So we have the great migration, which is in the 20th century. This is twofold. One, mechanization of the farms, and two, the First World War. The men go fight eventually, and the armies were segregated. So they needed labor, and there were just more and more factories being built. So north they went, and they went to the cities, and they worked in the factories. Women and then and then blacks were your big factory workers because you didn't have to pay them as much, and they were looking for work. And this pull factor of work and this push factor of getting the heck out of the South worked to spur the black community to other parts of America. And then we got jazz. Now, working on our scale analysis and going down to the next scale, within cities, within regions, you see movement. Um, African Americans reach the cities, and then they begin to cluster and live there, and then those areas become ghettos. And it's also important to note that the ghetto is a it's not a Jewish invention. It's an area where Jews lived as early as the 1300s, 14th century. Um, in certain parts of Europe, they would have almost like a Chinatown, have a Jewish part of the town. They would go out in the city and work. They would go back. They lock the gates, keep them in there, and so it was a place to segregate the Jewish community. And technically speaking, this is what ghettos and neighborhoods are. They're segregated portions of a city just without the physical walls. And as African Americans, more and more African Americans move, and more minorities move into cities, then their little enclaves, their little areas expand, 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 and push others out. Or, if we're being honest, the others leave on their own. So there is migration within regions. Again, if you have any questions, uh, send them to me, ask me. I'm still waiting to have an opportunity to make an explanatory video. But if you have questions, send them, and we'll have send them. Another thing that caused intra-regional migration, and this coincides with the African Americans coming to the cities, is the idea of white flight. Um, Brown versus the Board of Education, which you all know ended segregation, ended the separate but equal. Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal ideas of segregation. So the fact that fear of integration due to Brown versus the Board of Ed, the fear of the expansion of ghettos. Whites would flee from an area in anticipation of immigration. So I used to live in a city, but now here come all the poor people and the brown people and the Asian people and the Muslim people, and I gotta get out of here. So there's white flight. In fact, when I first moved to Raleigh 20 years ago, that's what I was told Wakefield was. That the Wakefield plantation and the whole Wakefield area was a Whitefield, or a whole thing of white flight. I was told, and this is just what I was told, that the whole that I think Wakefield was the first I think the first place in Wayne County where the elementary school, middle school, and high school were all there, and you would go from one to the other in a seamless transition, or as seamless as it can be in Wayne County. And they were told that these were their schools, and they didn't explain to the people that Wayne County buses to get to avoid this situation here. So white flight comes about because of that, and then there is this idea of blockbusting. Um, Real estate agents convinced the whites living near black areas to sell their house at a low price, and then agents would sell the houses back to blacks at a higher price. So you you depreciate the value of the land so that the housing market goes down, and then when blacks want to buy a house, you jack up the price. Another thing that is illegal that happened during this time period, and this comes up in the other unit, but I'll bring it up now, is the idea of let me see, I'll write it here, redlining. And I'll talk about this a little bit. And redlining is illegal, and banks do this. And what banks would do is literally draw a red line or draw a line around a certain area of a city where they would not sell property to minorities, to blacks, or to other minority that would stop, that would run counter to this. It would be anti-blockbusting. We're going to keep them out and keep those values high so those people are happy. That's illegal. Um, So there you go. And then the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders wrote that U.S. cities were divided into two separate and equal societies, one black and one white. Um, and we still see it now. And now another big thing that is impacting minorities living in the cities, or minorities finding housing in general, and not just black or poor people in general, um, disproportionately black people, but poor people in general, is the idea of gentrification. You push people out of an old neighborhood, you knock down the houses, build beautiful new ones, then you raise the property value and get more kids back in. Again, here's the idea of separate but equal. This comes about with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Basically, a guy buys a first class ticket, wants to go sit in the train, and they are told no, and that it is legal for him to sit in another place as long they can be separate from white people as long as it's equal. Now, um, their definition of equal was a little different. Their definition of equal was a train car, or a water fountain is a water fountain, a school is a school. It didn't have to be exactly the same, just school. So this happens. That's this court case, and then that court case leads to, especially in the South, massive segregation with Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow, if you don't know, was a white minstrel. It was minstrel shows in the early 1900s were a very popular thing where white men would go out in blackface and perform and act clownish because they felt that Africans were clownish people. And so the Jim Crow laws were laws to make black people even more um, uh, separate from the South. And this, the whole back of the bus, or could not sit in the same counters, or had to have food sent to them in the back of the grocery store. You could choose to serve whites only. So, and then Brown versus Board of Ed happens, and separate but equal was deemed unconstitutional. And then the civil rights movement comes about in the 50s and 60s with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and even um, Malcolm X and others, and it's still going on today. We still haven't figured it out yet. No dogs, Negroes, and Mexicans. I think that pretty much says it all. In South Africa, we had apartheid, which again, we begin repealing laws about segregation and race in the 60s. This goes on even further into the 90s, into South Africa and into Africa. Um, and it's again a small minority white population subjugating and taking control over a large black population. Um, and this goes on for the longest time in South Africa. It was the physical separation into actual different areas. There was a black part of South Africa and a white part of South Africa. In America, there was the illusion of people being together. In the South, I mean, they could walk the street, just different sides of the street. But in Africa, in South Africa, they were different parts, and you could not go in certain places. Um, Under apartheid law, a newborn baby was classified into four races, and each one had a different legal status. So depending upon your religion, sorry. Depending upon your race and your color and how you were born, that's where you were in life. White, colored, black, Asian are the four groups. Um, they had 10 homelands for black. You had to become a citizen of the homeland and move there, and that was your home in South Africa. So if you were born in South Africa, you actually had a separate, smaller micro home, an enclave within the country. This is okay. This is South Africa. So again, these are the different black homelands. These are proposed homelands. These are provinces. This is I see Lesotho, and where's the other one? Anyway, Lesotho. Oh, there's Swaziland and Lesotho. These are actually separate countries. And remember the term I used earlier, these are enclaves within a country. South Africa has two countries in it, Swaziland and Lesotho. And South Africa is considered a perforated state because there's holes in it. But these are the different homelands in different regions in South Africa. This was during the time of apartheid. These are the provinces post-apartheid now, like Limpopo or Northern Cape or Western Cape. All right, so those are the provinces, but the actual homelands where you had to live were the things in purple. And the other ones would have happened had apartheid not been repealed. And it was eventually done away with, well, because of Nelson Mandela, because of public pressure, because of all sorts of things. And they're still trying, I mean, just like America's trying to undo slavery and the inequalities in this country to this day, they still are working that out. And they're much earlier in these stages than we are. Okay. The white dominated government repealed the apartheid laws in 1991. The principal anti-apartheid leader was Nelson Mandela. He was actually in prison for 27 years. He went on to become the first black president in 1994. So even South Africa had a black president before we did. All right. And now the laws have been dismantled. Slowly beginning to normalize is is probably the truest way to say it. And one way you're going to notice it is here. I mean, again, income inequality, things of that sort. But that is typical and that is consistent with most places where a minority subjugated the majority. There's always a have and have not. So it's important that those groups are taken care of. Well, not taken care of, but that the disparity and the gaps in wages and the gaps in opportunity, they're going to take time because you have generations of people, generations of a culture that believes, that was taught that I am here and you are here. If and when North Korea ever becomes the former land of the great father and the dictatorship comes to an end, they're just not going to go, oh yay America. It's going to take time because they've had 70 years of it's our fault, we're awful. It takes time to normalize. Again, as much as we want American culture to be more inclusive, all the different groups who make America, who made it way back when, in the 1600s and 1700s, they have all their generation's history behind them. And then it gets interwoven into ours. And our culture is made up of all the baggage. Who we are is a byproduct of everybody that gets us to us. So to undo all that takes a lot of courage, takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of time. And unfortunately, we don't like waiting. All right. There, that's a good place to stop. That's the first half of ethnicity. We will pick up the second half of ethnicity tomorrow. I promise tomorrow. We're going to look at conflicts, ethnic conflicts, and we're going to look at ethnic cleansing and genocide. And that will finish ethnicity, and that'll lead us into the creation of countries and the creation of nations over this weekend. So I hope you all stay safe. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.